Hello class, this is Marcella again, and today's lecture is on stand dynamics. So what exactly is stand dynamics? We can characterize stand dynamics as the study of changes in forest stand structure with time, including stand behavior during and after disturbances. So basically, stand dynamics is the study of how forests change with time. And that time aspect captures all these other influences, including disturbance. So how stand structure, how stand composition is influenced by succession and by disturbances. So what is a disturbance? Um, think of think of some examples and try to put together a definition for a disturbance. Maybe one of the most common things when we think about disturbance is fire. So fire is one of those examples. So fire is a natural disturbance. It also is a natural disturbance. It's also one that's really been in the news lately with how it's impacting not only the forest communities, not only the stand dynamics, so that structure and composition, but also society. So the role that fire has on people that live near it, people that are fighting it, um, basically what it's doing in general to our society or what people think of fire. We can also, another big example might be insects and diseases. So this is the mountain pine beetle example, which is from the west. But we can think of some other insects and diseases that are more common in the eastern United States, such as hemlock woolly adelgid, emerald ash borer. So these are all examples of different kinds of disturbances. And so, what do all these examples, what do all these different um, stressors and environmental impacts, these different aspects, have in common? Well, we can look at this a few ways. And disturbance, the Dictionary of Forestry defines it as any relatively discrete event in time that disrupts ecosystem, community, or population structure and changes resources, substrate availability, or the physical environment. So, Prickett and White, this is a really foundational definition, and we can see the Dictionary of Forestry is using some of that same terminology. So, this relatively discrete events that disrupt the stand structure and or changes resource availability or the physical environment. So what we're talking about with disturbances is basically this is changing how growing space is allocated. And I think one of the key things hopefully you're looking at is this relatively discrete event. So what does that mean? So if we think back to the example, so an example of fire, we can think of that as a relative discrete event. So it has a start when the fire started and when the fire ended. And that's our disturbance. That start and end, and that's the start and end, and that is the disturbance event. So that is the discrete event. What about a minor what about if a branch falls on a tree? Could we think of that as a disturbance? So that would really we would have to really change how we were characterizing um, that ecosystem or community. So that branch fall, that small branch fall, may be very important if we're talking about an ecosystem such as small microorganisms or on a down dead log. That may change, that discrete event may change resources and substrate availability. So it all depends on how we're defining these terms: ecosystem, community, or population structure. So if we're talking about that, then maybe that's a disturbance. If we're talking about if our ecosystem maybe is our forest stand, or if we define the ecosystem as a forest or a stand, that change of one branch probably isn't changing the resource, substrate, or physical environment that much. It's probably not a noticeable change. However, a large wind throw, on the other hand, that is a discrete event that does disrupt the forest or the stand. So, disturbance, relative discrete event in time that disrupts ecosystem, community, or population structure. So and changes resources availability. So we really need to be clear when we define ecosystem, community, or population structure. So we looked at how to define a stand. So we talked about this definition of stand previously. So what is a stand? So hopefully when I asked you this question, what is a stand, you can answer with anything. There's no judgment here. So you can actually really try and answer these questions, because if I've asked them multiple times, there's probably a good chance they might be on an exam or quiz in the future. So what is a stand? Well, we can define a stand as the spatially contiguous group of trees and associated vegetation having similar structures and growing under similar soil and climatic conditions. And that definition is again from the Dictionary of Forestry. So, similar structure and growing under similar soil and climatic conditions. And remember, we talked about how we delineate a stand, how we decide what is a stand, is really going to be based on how fine of a scale we go down to. So there's a huge amount of variability with any forest ecosystem. And sometimes we can be lumpers or sometimes we can be splitters. So a stand, contiguous group of trees and associated vegetation having similar structure and growing under similar soil and climatic conditions. So we have our stand. How do we describe it? Well, we can describe it by talking about stand structure. So when we talk about structure, what are some kind of aspects of stand structure? Okay, so let's look at this picture. We have the stand. What are we seeing? What could we use to describe the stand? So we can talk about the physical, stand structure. So it's the physical and temporal distribution of trees and other plants in a stand. So the physical and temporal distribution. So we're talking about both what's on site and how that varies temporally. So we can describe this by species. So who's there, who's in the overstory, who's regenerating, what's our herbaceous species. We can also talk about vertical and horizontal spatial patterns. So what is that? Well, vertical, we can talk about the height. We can talk about the number of layers that the canopy has. We can talk about leaf area index. We can talk about crown ratios. So there's numerous ways we can describe stand structure. Horizontal spatial patterns. Again, we could talk about diameters. We can talk about hiding cover for animals. We could talk about plant ages. So where is the stand in a successional trajectory? So where is it? What's there? What is in our overstory? How old are those trees? What's in our understory? How old are those trees? So talking about stand dynamics, we have this description. So what is there? We also have this idea of talking about how stands, how forests respond to disturbance. So we don't have, it's not only understanding what's here, but what may be here in the future, or how the stand may be impacted by other stressors. So disturbance history. So this is we'll have this writing assignment on Thursday. So are disturbances a natural part of forest ecosystems? I want to take, after watching this, kind of think about it. We'll probably have about a 10-minute writing assignment next class. So think about it. Are disturbances a natural part of forest ecosystems? And this is kind of idea, yeah, they are. Disturbances are natural. They occur. Whether it's fire, blowdowns, those are all part of this natural forest ecosystems. However, this was not always the case. So disturbance was not always seen as natural. Some saw it as this kind of reset, this kind of disruption. And it is a disruption, but they thought it was this disruption of this orderly movement, this orderly progression within a forest community. So it was seen as this bad thing. Well, disturbance, how we should think of disturbance is disturbance is not good or bad. That's us putting our emotions on it. Disturbances occur. And as silviculturists, we have the ability to influence stand structure and composition, which can subsequently change disturbances. And we'll talk about that in a second. So why was disturbance not always seen as part of a natural forest ecosystem? Well, one of the things, travel and information transfer was just not the same. If you think about it, trees are very long-lived species. Some of them can live over 500 years. So in a life of a person, a life of a man or a woman, you may not see disturbance all the time. You may not see that stand replacing fire or that huge insect outbreak. So if you didn't see it, it's not occurring. So it's not natural. So that idea of just how information was transferred was just not the same back now. So it may not have been shared. And even when we think about the last 10 years, there's this huge difference in the rate that we're sharing information. Smartphones, GIS, all these technologies are allowing us to share more and more information and give us a better picture of our natural environment, our forest ecosystems. So disturbances can be man-made, and man-made disturbances in ecology and silviculture do influence natural disturbances. And sometimes we use these man-made disturbances, these silvicultural treatments, to mimic natural disturbance. So we can use treatments such as understory burning. So we can use understory burning to reduce density, so to maintain this kind of open understory, and that's made to mimic natural disturbances. However, we use them as tools because with with something like a tool, we can plan, we can implement. Whereas a natural disturbance, we can't plan when a lightning strike is going to happen or that influence. So we can use these tools to make sure we reduce insect populations. So maintaining endemic, endemic insect outbreaks, so very low levels of insects compared to those very high levels. We could also use it to minimize natural disturbances. So we can use these tools such as thinning in a wildland-urban interfaces. So we use the tool thinning, we use this intermediate treatment to reduce density, to reduce the potential for a huge stand replacing fire. So silviculture as a silviculturalist, you can influence these disturbances. You can influence this. And this is going to go back to your goals and objectives. So if you're working in an area that has a large wildland urban interface, your overarching goal may be to provide to reduce potential large disturbances in this wildland urban interfaces. And your objectives may include, I'm going to thin to such and such a basal area, or I'm going to make sure there's fire breaks or fuel breaks or certain species are planted. So really, silviculture uses these things as tools, and sometimes it's to mimic natural disturbances, and sometimes it's to minimize the potential natural disturbances. So how do we classify disturbances? Well, there's a lot of different ways we can classify disturbances, and I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm just going to touch on some of them. So we can have frequency, the distribution, return interval, the area covered, the magnitude, and a whole suite of other factors. So here's an example of of numerous forest ecosystems in the western United States. And why I'm using this example is because it's really nice. It's really kind of easy to see this progression. So we have elevation, and we see as we're increasing in elevation, we see different species. We have different zones. So we have a lower ecotone that's dominated by ponderosa pine, whereas if we go up in elevation, we have the subalpine, the spruce fir forest. And we can look at kind of the range of disturbances that are influencing this. So shrubland and ponderosa pine. So ponderosa pine are kind of these charismatic forest communities in the western United States. So those are the forests where you had these huge ponderosa pines with low density, and you had the cowboys or the early Forest Service folks riding through them, and you could see through these forests. They were open parklands. And so historically, these forests had very low to moderate severity fires that occurred every 10 years. So very low intensity, high frequency. Whereas now we can look at, okay, so this is what our historic disturbance regime. And remember, just a few seconds ago, I talked about silviculture can use different tools to influence disturbance regimes. So we've suppressed fire with fire suppression. So that's a tool that has been used throughout many forest systems across the United States. So we've suppressed fire and had soil disturbance and other factors which have increased tree density. And this increase in tree density, so we're changing the structure, we're influencing the stand dynamics, can lead to an increase in fire severity. So going from these very low intensity, high frequency fires to more high frequency but less frequent. So you can change your disturbance regime. Whereas when we look at maybe our spruce fir forest, generally high intensity, high severity stand replacing disturbances that occur every 100 years. So we can see there's a range of disturbances within this mountain. So within this mountainside, we can see not only do species change as we see changes in temperature and elevation, so we go from a more mesic to a more xeric, we see that the types of disturbance also change. So there's a range of disturbance frequencies, intensity, magnitudes, area covered. So this is really going to vary based on where you are working. So range of disturbance. So we can think of this as kind of two bookends. It can influence an individual. So we think of these very low insects or diseases. So one or two trees can be killed by a very low population of insects, whereas they can also span across a landscape. So mountain pine beetle, when it's at low population levels, generally kills one or two trees. So very low impact. Whereas once it gets up to these epidemic levels, it could span across a landscape. So it can be huge. So these, not only can we think about the amount of area impact, we can also think about how much of that area is impacted. So we can think of major stand replacing disturbances. So stand replacing, so that removes or kills all or almost all existing trees above the forest floor. Whereas more of a minor disturbance probably leaves some of those pre-disturbance trees alive. How do you think growing space would vary based in a minor disturbance versus a major disturbance? So a major stand replacing disturbance probably opens up that growing space. But since we're removing or killing all those existing trees, depending on the type of the disturbance, we can get other impacts after the disturbance, such as runoff or erosion, and that can really influence our growing space. Whereas with a minor disturbance, we probably didn't open it up as much, so there's probably not that. There's probably a smaller change in the amount of growing space available. However, since we left some of those pre-disturbance trees alive, they're probably going to be some of the ones that really benefit from this opening up. So they're really going to take advantage of this increase of this change in growing space and this opening of the growing space. So we can also talk about frequency. So here is kind of an idea. So frequency can vary from very infrequent and at regular intervals to very frequent and at regular intervals. So very infrequent and at irregular intervals to very frequent and at regular intervals. And a plant species will be found where their growth patterns and regeneration cycles are compatible with the frequency and regularity of disturbance. So a tree that takes 50 years to produce seeds is not going to be on a site that gets stand replacing disturbances every 20 years. So it's just never going to be, it's after one time, it's not going to be able to produce seed at the right rate. So plants and disturbances are they're going to be somewhat matched. So a plant species is going to be found where it can it can best take advantage of the disturbances. So talk about spatial patterns. We can talk about it being localized, such as this blowdown. So an individual tree or small group of trees blows down, and that can be a discrete, localized disturbances that influences and changes the distribution of resources. It's a very localized change, but it is a discrete event. It can also be across the landscape. So this is a huge blowdown that greatly changed that landscape and influenced growing space. It can also be a mosaic. So we can talk about edge effect. So edge effect is the influence of the disturbed areas influence within the surrounding stand. So when we think, if we go back to this example, we can see this line here. That would be your area where you have an edge. So these trees are standing. So those trees on the edge have this wider opening of growing space than the trees in, say, the interior. So they're able to take advantage of more of that sunlight. They're also exposed to other aspects such as wind and so mainly, in this case, a lot of wind, which can also cause them to blow down and break. So this edge effect, it influences the surrounding stand. So that finishes up our lecture on stand dynamics, this very introductory lecture. So what do you have to do before next class? So finish your data sheet. You have 2 readings, so Seymour and White, and then Oliver and Larson. And then next class we'll be doing your presentation. Also be prepared for that 10-minute writing assignment. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments, just send me an email. Thanks!